The airport buzzed with its usual chaos. Rolling suitcases clattered across the tiled floor. Children laughed as they chased each other through crowded aisles, and announcements echoed over loudspeakers. Amidst it all stood Captain Elena Carter, a decorated soldier in her crisp uniform adorned with medals that spoke of years spent serving her country. Her dark brown eyes scanned the bustling terminal as she adjusted the strap of her carry-on bag on her shoulder. Elena had just completed what would be her final deployment before retirement. For 20 years she had given everything to protect others, but today she was simply a traveler eager to return home. She carried more than luggage. She carried memories, both beautiful and painful, from places far away. Yet, despite the weariness etched into her face, there was an unmistakable strength about her, a quiet dignity that demanded respect. As she approached the gate for Flight 407, Elena noticed something unusual. A man in a tailored suit stood near the entrance, his posture stiff and impatient. He held a ticket marked first class and seemed to be arguing quietly with the flight attendant. His voice grew louder as he gestured toward Elena, who had already been seated at the front of the boarding line due to military protocol. "I don't care what your policy is," the man said sharply, his tone dripping with entitlement. "I paid for this seat and I expect to have it." The flight attendant looked flustered but firm. "Sir, we prioritize active duty service members in accordance with airline policy. Captain Carter has every right to board first," the man scoffed, glancing briefly at Elena's uniform before turning back to the attendant. "Policy or not, I'm sure she can manage sitting somewhere else. This isn't exactly fair to paying customers like me." A ripple of murmurs spread among the passengers waiting behind him. Some exchanged uncomfortable glances, while others stared openly, unsure how to react. Elena felt her jaw tighten slightly, though she remained outwardly calm. She wasn't unfamiliar with prejudice, she'd faced it many times throughout her career. But hearing such blatant disrespect in public still stung. Before anyone could respond further, the man stepped forward aggressively, pointing at Elena. "You know what? Fine. Take my seat if you want it so badly, but don't think this makes you special, you're just doing a job." His words hung heavy in the air, sharp enough to cut through the noise of the busy terminal. Elena took a deep breath, refusing to let anger cloud her expression. Instead, she offered him a small, polite smile. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice steady. "But no thanks are necessary. I earned this seat." For a moment, the man froze, caught off guard by her composure. Then, shaking his head, in frustration he stormed past her and disappeared down the jetway without another word. The tension dissipated slowly as the rest of the passengers resumed their boarding process, some offering Elena nods of approval or quiet words of support. Though outwardly composed, Elena couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. She didn't understand why people felt the need to build walls instead of bridges. Still, she reminded herself why she served, to make the world better, even when it resisted change. Little did she know, however, that this encounter was only the beginning. What happened next would leave everyone involved, including the rude stranger, utterly astonished. As Captain Elena Carter settled into her first-class seat by the window, she tried to push the earlier confrontation out of her mind. She adjusted her uniform jacket, placing her carry-on bag carefully under the seat in front of her. The soft hum of the plane's engines began to drown out the lingering tension from the boarding gate. Yet, no matter how hard she focused on the view outside, clouds rolling lazily across the sky, she couldn't shake the feeling that something about this flight was going to be different. A few rows behind her, in economy class, sat the man who had caused the scene. His name was Gregory Hayes, a successful real estate developer known for his sharp business acumen and even sharper tongue. To Gregory, life was a series of transactions. Everything had a price, and he believed he deserved the best because he paid for it. But as he fidgeted uncomfortably in his narrow seat, squeezed between two strangers, he found himself replaying the incident over and over in his head. He glanced toward the front of the plane, where Elena sat calmly, her posture straight and composed. For reasons he couldn't explain, her quiet confidence unsettled him. He muttered under his breath, annoyed not just with her but also with himself for letting the situation bother him so much. Meanwhile, Elena opened a small journal she always carried with her. It was filled with sketches, notes, and reflections from her deployments, a way for her to process the weight of her experiences. As the plane soared higher, she started writing about the day's events, describing the man's behavior without judgment, simply observing it as part of the human condition. Unbeknownst to either of them, fate had other plans for their journey. About an hour into the flight, turbulence hit unexpectedly. The plane jolted violently, causing gasps and cries of alarm among the passengers. Drinks spilled, luggage tumbled from overhead compartments, and the cabin lights flickered ominously. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some rough weather. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Elena gripped the armrest tightly, her training kicking in as she assessed the situation. Turbulence wasn't new to her. She'd flown through far worse, but she knew how frightening it could be for civilians. Across the aisle, a young mother struggled to calm her crying toddler while clutching her own seatbelt. Sensing the woman's distress, Elena leaned over gently. "It's okay," she said softly, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "We'll get through this. Just focus on your breathing." Her words seemed to have an immediate effect. The mother nodded, taking slow, deliberate breaths as she held her child closer. Nearby passengers noticed the exchange and began calming down too, drawing strength from Elena's presence. In row 12, Gregory clutched his armrests so tightly his knuckles turned white. Unlike others, he hadn't experienced turbulence like this before, and panic bubbled up inside him. He hated feeling powerless, especially in situations beyond his control. When another violent shake rattled the plane, he accidentally knocked over his coffee cup, spilling its contents onto his lap. Frustrated and embarrassed, he cursed under his breath. Just then, one of the flight attendants hurried down the aisle, checking on passengers. Seeing Gregory's predicament, she stopped briefly to hand him napkins. "Are you all right, sir?" she asked kindly. "I'm fine," he snapped, though his tone betrayed his fear. The attendant moved on, but moments later, another figure appeared beside him, Captain Elena Carter. Somehow, during the commotion, she had made her way back to coach class. Without saying a word, she handed him a clean towel from her bag and crouched down to his level. "You don't have to face this alone," she said simply, meeting his gaze. Her voice was warm yet firm, leaving no room for argument. For the first time since boarding the plane, Gregory felt a flicker of something he hadn't expected: gratitude. And with that single act of kindness, the walls he'd built around himself began to crack. The turbulence eventually subsided, leaving the plane eerily quiet as passengers caught their breath. Captain Elena Carter returned to her seat in first class, but not before exchanging a few more reassuring words with Gregory. Though he hadn't said much in response, his clenched jaw and furrowed brow had softened slightly, a small victory she didn't take for granted. Back in her seat, Elena stared out the window, watching the clouds drift lazily below. Her mind wandered to the man in row 12. She wondered what kind of life he led, what fears drove his actions, and whether her brief act of kindness might leave any lasting impression. Gregory, on the other hand, couldn't stop thinking about Elena. He wasn't used to people showing him compassion without expecting something in return. In his world, relationships were transactions, business deals, networking events, favors, exchanged. But this woman, a stranger, had offered help simply because she saw someone in need. It unsettled him, forcing him to confront emotions he'd long buried beneath layers of pride and ambition. As the flight attendants resumed their duties, one of them approached Elena with a warm smile. "Thank you for stepping in back there," she said quietly. "You really helped calm everyone down." Elena shook her head modestly. "It's nothing. Just doing what I can." The attendant hesitated for a moment before adding, "That man you helped, he doesn't usually react well to unexpected situations. I've seen him fly before. He's not exactly easy to please." Elena chuckled softly. "I noticed. But we all have our struggles, don't we?" Her words lingered in the attendant's mind as she walked away, leaving Elena alone with her thoughts once again. Meanwhile, Gregory wrestled with his own inner turmoil. For years, he'd prided himself on being self-reliant, believing that asking for help was a sign of weakness. Yet here he was, sitting in a cramped economy seat, still gripping the towel Elena had given him like it was a lifeline. Feeling restless, Gregory unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up, ignoring the curious glances from nearby passengers. He needed fresh air, or at least a moment away from the suffocating confines of coach class. As he made his way toward the front of the plane, he spotted Elena flipping through the pages of her journal. Her expression was calm, almost serene, and for some reason, it annoyed him. "What are you writing?" he blurted out, surprising even himself. Elena looked up, startled but unfazed. "Just reflections," she replied evenly. "Things I've seen, moments that matter." Gregory frowned, unsure how to respond. "Reflections? About what happened earlier?" She tilted her head slightly, studying him with those steady brown eyes. "Not specifically. Life is full of moments like that. Opportunities to connect, to understand each other better. Sometimes we seize them, sometimes we don't." Her word struck a nerve. Gregory shifted uncomfortably, his defenses rising again. "Look, I'm not here for a lecture. I just wanted to say thanks. For the towel, and for, well, you know." To his surprise, Elena smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached her eyes. "You're welcome. We all need a little help sometimes." For a moment, Gregory considered walking away, retreating back to the safety of his carefully constructed walls. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the sincerity in her voice or the way she seemed to see past his abrasive exterior. Whatever it was, it compelled him to stay. "Why do you do it?" he asked abruptly, surprising himself again. "Help people, I mean. You barely know me, and yet you went out of your way to make sure I was okay." Elena closed her journal and placed it gently on the empty seat beside her. "Because it's the right thing to do," she said simply, "and because I believe every person deserves respect, no matter who they are or where they come from." Gregory opened his mouth to argue, to defend his earlier behavior, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he sank into the nearest available seat, feeling oddly vulnerable yet strangely at ease. As the plane soared onward, neither of them realized how much this chance encounter would change both their lives, for the better. The hum of the plane's engines filled the silence between Elena and Gregory as they sat near each other, in an unspoken truce. For a moment, neither spoke, Gregory staring at his hands, lost in thought, while Elena watched him with quiet curiosity. She didn't push him to talk. Instead, she gave him space, sensing that he needed time to gather his thoughts. Finally, Gregory broke the silence. "You must think I'm a terrible person," he said, his voice low but tinged with regret. "After everything back at the gate, the way I acted." Elena shook her head gently. "I don't judge people based on one bad day. We all have moments we aren't proud of. What matters is what we do after those moments." Her words hung in the air, simple yet profound. Gregory sighed, running a hand through his neatly combed hair. "It's not just today. That's how I've always been, focused on myself, my goals, my needs. It's like I forgot how to see anyone else." Elena leaned forward slightly, her gaze softening. "Maybe you didn't forget. Maybe life just got loud enough that it drowned out the quieter voices around you." Gregory raised an eyebrow, intrigued by her perspective. "Loud? How so?" "Well," she began, folding her hands in her lap, "when you're chasing success or trying to prove yourself, it's easy to get caught up in your own world. You start seeing obstacles instead of opportunities, to grow, to connect, to learn from others. But those quieter voices, the ones asking for understanding, kindness, they're still there. They never really go away." Gregory frowned, considering her words. He had spent decades building walls around himself, convinced that vulnerability was weakness. Yet here was someone who saw strength and compassion, who believed that helping others wasn't a burden but a privilege. It challenged everything he thought he knew about life. What made you become a soldier? he asked suddenly, surprising even himself. Elena smiled faintly, as if she'd been expecting the question. My father served before me. Growing up, I admired his dedication, not just to his country but to the people he protected. I wanted to make a difference too, to stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. And did you? Gregory pressed, his tone earnest now. I tried, she admitted. There were hard days when I questioned whether I was making any real impact. But then I'd meet someone, a child in a war-torn village, a fellow soldier struggling with their demons, and I'd remember why I started. Sometimes it's the smallest acts of kindness that leave the biggest mark. Gregory nodded slowly, absorbing her words. He glanced toward the window, where sunlight streamed through the clouds, casting golden streaks across the cabin. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope, a possibility that maybe he could change, that it wasn't too late to be better. You know, he said finally, turning back to Elena, most people would have written me off by now. They'd call me selfish, arrogant, whatever. But you keep giving me chances. That's because everyone deserves a second chance, Elena replied simply. Including you. A weight seemed to lift off Gregory's shoulders, replaced by a strange sense of gratitude. He didn't know exactly what lay ahead for him, but for the first time in a long time he felt ready to face it. As the plane continued its journey, the distance between them, both physical and emotional, began to shrink, paving the way for something neither had anticipated: friendship. As the plane cruised steadily through the sky, Gregory found himself opening up in ways he never imagined. The walls he had built over decades were beginning to crack, and Elena's calm demeanor made it easier for him to share pieces of his life he rarely spoke about, even to himself. I wasn't always like this, Gregory admitted, his voice quieter now, almost reflective. When I was younger, I cared more about people. My mom used to say I had a heart too big for my own good. Elena listened intently, her hands resting gently on her lap. What changed? She asked softly, encouraging him to continue. Gregory hesitated, staring at the floor as if searching for answers written there. Life happened, I guess. My dad left when I was 10, and Mom worked 2 jobs just to keep us afloat. By the time I got older, I promised myself I'd never struggle like she did, so I worked hard. Too hard, maybe. And somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking about anyone but myself. He paused, his jaw tightening briefly before he forced himself to relax. I climbed the ladder, closed deals, made money. People respected me, or at least they pretended to. But the higher I went, the lonelier it felt. I convinced myself it didn't matter because I was winning. But deep down, his voice trailed off heavy with unspoken regret. You weren't happy, Elena finished for him, her tone gentle yet firm. Gregory nodded slowly. No, I wasn't. Not really. And then today, seeing you, hearing you talk about serving others, it made me realize how much I've lost sight of what truly matters. Elena leaned forward slightly, her expression thoughtful. You know, sometimes we get so caught up in chasing success that we forget why we started in the first place. It's okay to take a step back and ask yourself what you really want. What kind of person do you want to be? Her words struck a chord deep within Gregory. He thought about all the missed opportunities, the friendships he'd let fade, the family gatherings he'd skipped, the moments he could have been present but chose work instead. For years, he had convinced himself that success would fill the void inside him. But sitting here now, talking to someone who radiated purpose and compassion, he realized how wrong he had been. What about you? Gregory asked suddenly, shifting the focus to Elena. You've given so much of yourself to others. Do you ever feel tired? Like you've sacrificed too much? Elena smiled faintly, her gaze drifting toward the window. Of course I do. There are days when the weight feels unbearable, but then I remind myself why I chose this path. Every sacrifice comes with meaning. Every challenge shapes who we are. And honestly, the joy I find in helping others outweighs the pain. Gregory studied her face, marveling at the strength and peace she exuded. She wasn't perfect, far from it, but she carried herself with a grace that came from living authentically. It inspired him in ways he couldn't fully articulate. A flight attendant approached, offering drinks and snacks. Both declined politely, their attention still focused on each other. As the cabin grew quieter, Gregory felt a sense of clarity washing over him, a resolve to change, however daunting it might seem. "You're different, Elena," he said finally, his voice tinged with admiration. "Most people wouldn't have bothered with someone like me, but you saw something worth saving." Elena met his gaze, her eyes steady and warm. "We all have light inside us, Gregory. Sometimes it just needs a little help to shine through." For the first time in years, Gregory allowed himself to believe that his light hadn't gone out. It had simply been hidden. And perhaps with Elena's guidance, he could rediscover it. As the plane descended toward its final destination, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted. Passengers began gathering their belongings, preparing for landing, but Elena and Gregory remained seated, still caught up in their conversation. The bond they had formed over the past few hours felt almost surreal. Two strangers brought together by circumstance, yet connected by something deeper. Gregory glanced at his watch, then back at Elena. "I don't want this to end," he admitted, surprising even himself with the honesty of his words. "Talking to you has made me see things differently. I feel like I've been given a second chance." Elena smiled warmly, her eyes reflecting understanding. "Second chances are powerful," she said, "but they only work if you're willing to act on them. What will you do when you step off this plane?" Gregory hesitated, his mind racing, with possibilities. He thought about the life he'd built, the luxurious apartment, the high-profile clients, the endless meetings, and realized how empty it all felt now. For years, he had chased success without considering what truly mattered. But today, thanks to Elena, he saw a path forward, a way to rebuild not just his career but his character. "I think," he began slowly, choosing his words carefully, "I think I'll start small. Maybe volunteer somewhere, use my skills to help people instead of just making money. And I should reconnect with my family. I owe them that much, at least." Elena nodded approvingly. "That's a good place to start. Change doesn't happen overnight, but every step counts." A flight attendant announced their imminent arrival, jolting Gregory back to reality. He looked out the window, watching as the ground grew closer. His heart raced, not with fear but with anticipation. For the first time in years, he felt hopeful about the future. "You know," he said, turning back to Elena, "I never expected to meet someone like you today. You didn't have to help me, but you did." "Why?" Elena chuckled softly, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Because everyone deserves compassion, Gregory. Even someone who starts off being rude," she teased lightly, earning a sheepish grin from him. Then her expression softened. "Besides, I believe people can change. Sometimes they just need someone to remind them that they're capable of more than they think." Her words lingered in Gregory's mind as the plane touched down gently on the runway. Applause erupted from some passengers, a customary gesture after a safe landing, but Gregory barely noticed. All he could focus on was the woman sitting across from him, whose quiet strength had changed the course of his life. When the seatbelt sign turned off and passengers began disembarking, Gregory stood reluctantly. He extended his hand toward Elena, unsure how else to express his gratitude. To his surprise, she ignored his outstretched hand and pulled him into a brief hug instead. "Take care of yourself, Gregory," she said warmly. "And remember, you're stronger than you realize." Touched beyond words, Gregory stepped into the aisle, clutching his carry-on bag tightly. As he walked toward the exit, he glanced back one last time. Elena waved at him with a smile before returning to her journal, already lost in thought. Outside the airport, Gregory paused under the bright sunlight, feeling a sense of renewal wash over him. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years he felt ready to face it, with purpose, with kindness, and with hope. The weeks that followed the flight seemed to pass in a blur for Gregory Hayes. He had returned home, with a newfound sense of purpose, determined to honor the lessons Elena had unknowingly taught him. At first, the changes were small, calling his younger sister to catch up after years of silence, donating unused items to a local shelter, and even apologizing to an old colleague he'd once treated poorly. But as time went on, those small steps grew into something more meaningful. One evening, Gregory found himself standing outside a community center in his neighborhood. It was a modest building, its walls painted a cheerful shade of blue, but inside, it buzzed with life. Children laughed as they played games. Volunteers served hot meals to families in need, and workshops were held to teach job skills to unemployed adults. Gregory had signed up to volunteer here, unsure of what to expect but eager to contribute in some way. As he helped organize shelves stocked with donated food, a young boy approached him shyly, clutching a worn teddy bear. "Are you new here?" the boy asked, his wide eyes filled with curiosity. Gregory knelt down to meet the child's gaze. "Yeah, I am. My name's Gregory. What's yours?" "Liam," the boy replied, grinning now. "You're really tall." Gregory chuckled, ruffling Liam's hair affectionately. "Well, I guess that makes me good at reaching high places." For the rest of the afternoon, Gregory worked alongside other volunteers, feeling a sense of fulfillment he hadn't experienced in years. He realized how much joy could come from simply being present, from giving his time and energy to others without expecting anything in return. By the end of the day, his muscles ached, but his heart felt lighter than it had in decades. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to Gregory, Elena Carter had also embarked on her own journey of reflection. After retiring from the military, she decided to dedicate herself to mentoring young veterans transitioning back to civilian life. Her days were spent sharing stories, offering guidance, and reminding them that their service mattered, not just during deployment, but every day afterward. One crisp autumn morning, as Elena walked through a park near her home, she noticed a familiar figure sitting on a bench. At first, she thought her eyes were playing tricks on her, but when the man turned around, she recognized him immediately. "Gregory!" she called out, her voice tinged with surprise. He stood up quickly, smiling broadly. "Elena, I can't believe it's you." They embraced warmly, both amazed by the coincidence. As they sat together on the bench, Gregory shared everything that had happened since their flight. The volunteering, reconnecting with his family, and rediscovering parts of himself he thought were lost forever. "I owe it all to you," he said earnestly. "You showed me there's more to life than chasing success. You reminded me who I used to be and who I still can be." Elena shook her head modestly. "I didn't do anything special. You did the hard work, Gregory. All I did was remind you of your potential." Gregory smiled, tears glistening in his eyes. "Still, thank you for everything." As they parted ways later that day, promising to stay in touch, Elena couldn't help but feel proud, not just of Gregory, but of humanity itself. She knew not everyone would change so dramatically, but moments like these proved that kindness, no matter how small, could create ripples far beyond what anyone might expect. And as Gregory drove home, he glanced at the dashboard clock and smiled. For the first time in years, he wasn't rushing to get anywhere. Instead, he was savoring the moment, knowing he was exactly where he was meant to be. This final part wraps up the story with closure and hope, showing how both characters have grown and transformed because of their encounter. Let me know if you'd like any adjustments or additional details.